Welcome to this new episode of the Bitcoin Latam Report. I have Boyd Cohen, CSO of Arcadia B, a fellow Bitcoiner here in Mexico. Welcome, Boyd, to the podcast. I'm really happy to have you. I think we're going to have a great conversation.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, we've had the chance to interact in person several times. Just another reconnect.
Yes, you were coming to La BitConf, but it got pushed away. So I hope to see you in Mexico City soon. We're filming this. I'm filming this from La Casa de Satoshi. So hope you can visit soon as well.
I love that place. That's like the epicenter of all things Bitcoin in Mexico. So yeah, I'll definitely be back.
We're working hard on making this happen. Okay, so let's jump right to it. Every Bitcoin podcast kind of starts with the background of the person I'm interviewing, just so people can have a little bit more context. So, can you explain how you became a Bitcoiner? And also, you have a specific story, a little bit like me, where you moved to Latin America. So, can you combine both and maybe they're somehow related? So, curious on your Bitcoin story and Latam story.
Yeah, sure. So I got my PhD. I'm from the States, so I'm a gringo, but I've lived outside of the US since 2001. In fact, so I moved to Spain first, then Canada, and then Argentina and Chile, then back to Spain, and then to Mexico 2 years ago. The first time I got exposure to why Bitcoin matters was actually after Bitcoin was born, but I still didn't know about Bitcoin yet. When I moved to Argentina, 2012, they implemented what they call control de cambio. We call it currency controls in English. And I had just moved there as an expat. I was a professor of an entrepreneurship center and director of the center at a private business school there. And within a month of moving there, the government implemented these controls, and that involved, I won't bore your listeners with all the details, but I think a lot of people that are from developed countries don't understand what it's like to live in a developing country that has like rampant hyperinflation and currency control. So you'd see things like the prices would change in the supermarket from the morning to the afternoon. People try to dollarize things. So like you're paying rent in pesos because you're getting paid in pesos. And then the owners of the homes say, no, we can't take pesos anymore. There's too much inflation. We need to get paid in dollars, but you can't get dollars. So then in Argentina, we had to go through this thing called dollar blue, which were like these like back office, like hidden stores where you had to bring cash, literally fiat cash, like Argentine pesos, and pay like a black market price for the dollars that you needed to pay for rent. When I traveled to other market countries, I couldn't take money out of the ATM because the government put controls on that. So it was terrible. So that's the first time I like ever lived the experience of somebody in a developing economy facing hyperinflation, all that. And then fast forward, I lived in Chile because it was more stable economy than Spain, etc. When I was in Spain, I was observing, what had happened after the Occupy movement. So, like after 2008, 2009, great financial crisis, banks too big to fail, and a lot of protests on the street. And my PhD's in business, and my first book was called Climate Capitalism. I have 3 books now that have the word capitalism in it. But my one of my books, I forget what number it was. This one, Post-Capitalist Entrepreneurship. So I started at this time, this would have been now 2016. Started saying, okay, something is wrong with the economy. And even though my background is in business and I worked at Accenture before, and I've been an adherent to capitalism, I started to feel like maybe capitalism is broken and that we need something different, something better. And I started trying to figure out what the something better would be. And I stumbled on crypto and blockchain and Bitcoin back then, 2016. It's not that I never heard about it before, but it was the first time I started looking at it a little more detail. Think about, well, maybe there's another way we can organize our economy where it's decentralized and democratized. We take the power out of the hands of the monopolies and the oligopolies, and we give power back to the people who then co-own these platforms, these protocols. And I went down that rabbit hole for a long time, of course, writing this book, and then got excited about building in the blockchain space. And I know for all of us in the Bitcoin community, what I'm about to say sounds like blasphemy and like, you know, idiotic, but I bought into the whole narrative around how blockchains and crypto could decentralize, democratize the world. So I never got into shit coining or meme coins or like even investing in most crypto. I wasn't really doing that. I was building. So I started a company called IMOB, which stood for the Internet of Mobility. We wanted to build a decentralized mobility protocol. I left the academic world because I've gone back and forth between academics and the private sector and starting companies. And I started this company. We got to about 30 people. We raised venture money. We were gonna do an ICO. I know, evil, crappy, ugly stuff, but we believed in it. We believed in the idea of tokenizing a global decentralized mobility network. And we built some crazy good technology. But like many things in crypto, we weren't able to get enough product market fit. We weren't able to cross the chasm. We weren't able to scale the business. And at some point, I got burnt out. I tried pivoting the product, adding a new one, didn't work. And told my co-founder, I'm like, look, I'm not the right person to do this anymore. I can't find a path forward. And I had lost my conviction on what we were building. Took some time off, ended up here in Mexico, went deeper down the Bitcoin rabbit hole way over the last 2 years. So I was exposed to it like meaningfully since 2016, but didn't take it too seriously till about 2 years ago. Got more and more serious about it. Realized my original diagnostic that it was capitalism was a problem was flawed. It wasn't capitalism, it was the money itself, it was fiat. And so I went deeper and deeper down that rabbit hole, wrote this book, Bitcoin Singularity, which I launched for the first time at La Casa de Satoshi. I think that's the first time I met you in Mexico City, whenever that was, so almost a year ago, I guess. And I started teaching Bitcoin education at EGADE Business School, which is the number one business school in Latin America as part of Tecnológico de Monterrey. We're very early in the world in having courses in Bitcoin at, graduate business school level. You know very well how it is, and so do many of your listeners. But like, once the orange pill gets inside you, it doesn't come out, and it just like gets deeper into your soul until you feel like you can't do anything else with your life but focus on growing adoption somehow. And so I felt like I wasn't doing enough at the university and I needed to get back into the private sector. And, you know, I met Jose Carlos Flores, who I know you know. He had started KapitalX back in 2017 in Mexico, longest running Bitcoin company in the country, just Bitcoin, I should say, as opposed to say Bitso, which of course is a crypto platform like Coinbase for your listeners who don't know. And so, yeah, I joined as an executive while I was still an academic at EGADE in July of last year. And then I don't know if you know this, but January 1, I'm officially full-time only in Arcadia B, and I'm an adjunct professor so I'm not doing anything active with them right now. Although we are going to be hosting a Bitcoin executive education program that I'm leading later this year.
A really complete answer. You like answered three of my next questions in the same answer, so that's perfect. Yeah, it's really fascinating the fact that you started in Argentina. I have to get an Argentinian on the podcast to really delve into this because we could basically talk about just Argentina case for really long hours, I think. So yeah, you basically arrive at like the my next question, which was like once you met Jose Flores, you know, what was the initial conversation that you had together to make the shift from KapitalX to Arcadia B and the idea of the Bitcoin Treasury company here, the first one in Mexico, and if you can also explain what is a Bitcoin Treasury company for in layman terms for those who don't know, that would be great.
So I met Jose Carlos through a network connection in the Bitcoin community. So I started just trying to build my network here. Honestly, I wasn't sure if I was going to try to start my own Bitcoin company, if I was going to join one, if it would be maybe more of a global player that I would participate with. I started talking to some layer twos in the Bitcoin space, just like exploring things. When I had the meeting with Jose Carlos, it wasn't with the intention of finding a way to work with him. It was just building my network of people who are deep in the space and good thinkers and long term convicted on Bitcoin. And he definitely fits that criteria. And when he was telling me about the business, I thought it was interesting, but I had looked at the website and it didn't feel like it was like a super ambitious, scalable company. And I think maybe because I'm American, I have this mindset of like go big, go home in a way. Like you either have to build something really big or you don't. So I didn't go into that meeting thinking we were going to align on wanting to do something together. It's more just like getting to know each other. And I've been researching, including for my book, I had a chapter on Bitcoin treasury companies. And one of the things I was looking at was it viable to launch a Bitcoin treasury company in Mexico? And so that was one of my questions I asked him as like a thought leader expert about Bitcoin in Mexico. I didn't actually initially anticipate it would be something he would, be interested in or whatever. And he wasn't at first. He's like, I don't think there's much space for that in Mexico. The market's not ready. Not enough people know about it. The institutions aren't there yet. The government doesn't get it yet. So I didn't push it very much after that, even in my own mind. And then fast forward, we went to Vegas. He and I were both in Vegas, but we didn't go together. When he was in Vegas, he started talking to people and they were basically saying, hey, there's a play for Treasury company in Mexico. I said, well, maybe Boyd's right. And he came back and said, hey, we should look at this again. Maybe we could do something together. And then long story short, we agreed I would join as CSO, which would have two roles. One was to accelerate the underlying Bitcoin business we have, and the other was to launch a treasury strategy. So what is a Bitcoin treasury company? There's not necessarily one universally approved answer to that question, and it's sometimes quite contested discussion around what is a treasury company. So basically, I would say it's like most things in life, it's not black and white. It's not like, oh, this company is a treasury company, this one is not. There's a spectrum. Any company who agrees to have any amount of their retained earnings or their balance sheet, their treasury in Bitcoin could be seen as a Bitcoin treasury company. Depends on how you define it. So they might be a retail store. So a lot of your listeners are familiar with circular economy in the Bitcoin community where you have like, I don't know, a coffee shop and they accept Bitcoin. So 95% of their customers pay in fiat. Here it would be pesos. 5% pay in Bitcoin. All right. Well, a lot of these companies that have that kind of customer base, they basically choose to hodl the Bitcoin they've earned from customers. So if only 5% of their customers pay in Bitcoin, they just say, okay, that's our forced savings plan. So they just keep that Bitcoin they've earned and they use that as their savings. Well, that's a type of Bitcoin treasury company, if you want to call it that. Depends on how you look at it. There are other private companies that are stacking Bitcoin in one way or another. But like the classical definition or thinking around what a true treasury company is one that uses the public capital markets. Thus, the company needs to do an IPO or do something to be able to issue public debt, convertibles, equity in the public market. So on the stock exchange in their local country. And what they do with those use of proceeds, so that money they generate from these raises goes mostly to Bitcoin. When I say mostly, like our philosophy at Arcadia B is to say, like at a minimum, our goal is always 80% or more of the capital raise goes to buying Bitcoin and putting it in our treasury. 20% could go to other things, whether that's the legal costs of the issuance, whether that's supporting our underlying operating business. So those are the kinds of things that treasury companies do. There's a lot more depth to the nuance of how they do it. And, that's what we're doing here in Mexico is the first company aspiring to be a publicly traded treasury company.
Great. Yeah, so in my head, a Bitcoin treasury company, as you said, is more like a company that buys Bitcoin in order to resell some other financial instruments to the public so they can benefit from Bitcoin price appreciation without necessarily holding the asset themselves. Because as you said, you can also hold Bitcoin as a company just as a matter of saving your profits and eventually profiting from the profits to expand your business in the future. And eventually, every company, hopefully in the future, will be a Bitcoin treasury company. So, yeah, I'm curious about the actual legal process. I know that Jose has talked a little bit about that on the podcast, Build with Bitcoin. I can imagine be really hard out as well. We went through some legal stuff. The process in Mexico is really difficult and cumbersome. So maybe you can share a little bit like how it has been going so far. Any tips, anything you learned so far about the market?
You're right. I mean, Mexico is very bureaucratic. I mean, most countries are, there's a handful of countries that pride themselves or trying to be more efficient with processes like, UAE, Dubai, etc. But like most countries, from my life experience, because I've lived in many countries, that they don't make these things that easy to like do something like create a public company. There's a lot of hoops you have to go through. There's something interesting in Mexico that many people inside and outside Mexico don't know, which is that there is a pathway to list tradable instruments on the public stock markets without being a public company. So to be a public company, normally that means you have issued an IPO, an initial public offering, or something similar, acquiring a public shell company that's already public. But basically, in most countries in the world, if you want to issue any public instruments that the capital markets can invest in a public way that are tradable with like a stock ticker, the only way to do that is to first do an IPO, an initial public offering, which is a way of selling your shares, a percentage of your equity in the open market. And then those shares are openly tradable by anyone who's bought them or wants to buy. So that's like the normal path to public market and how most public treasury companies are doing this. They're either taking an existing public company like Metaplanet did in Japan and pivoting to a treasury strategy, or they're taking a private company public like Andrew Webley did with Smarter Web in the UK, where they were a private web design firm, web advisory firm. He wanted to do the treasury strategy while not abandoning the operating business. So he took the operating business public. Or there are companies that are buying a shell or doing what's called a SPAC or some other way of getting a public entity, trying to do it quicker. But basically, in most countries in the world, you somehow have to have a company that already is issuing shares through an IPO or has some other public approval already. So it's already a public company. What's different about Mexico is there's an interim path, which is the one we're doing, which allows you to raise money from the public markets with a tradable ticker before you're actually public, before you've done an initial public offering. So the first version of this is called a régimen simplificado, which is fairly new law. In fact, no one has yet issued a régimen simplificado in Mexico because the law was approved in the last couple years, but then the stock markets had to get on board and like get processes approved by the government. And then the investment banks that help companies issue these instruments have to get on board. So no one's done one yet. But our régimen simplificado is designed to be the fastest, cheapest, most reasonable way to get an instrument into the public market. That's what we've been working on for a while, but there's a lot of steps along the way. And the first major one is you have to have 2 to 3 years of recent financial reports publicly audited. So this doesn't work for a new startup. You can't do it that way. You either have to buy an existing company that has a longer history, like a private company, or you have to acquire a public company because you need to have this 2 or 3 years of audited financial results in Mexico before you're eligible to start the process. So that's like phase one. The régimen simplificado is the first type of instrument you can issue. To issue that, the first thing you have to do is there's some other like minimum criteria around incorporation, all that stuff. But outside of that, you need to get your audited reports done. And it has to come from a very credible sort of multinational type auditor. It can't be like a local boutique normally, because either the stock markets won't accept that audit or the investors, the institutional investors and others won't trust the audit. So you have to do the audit process, which is what we're going through right now. And that's time consuming. In fact, the first step we went through was something called a diagnostic, where Baker Tilly, which is an international accounting firm, had to do this very rigorous 2 months process to look at all our accounts. And when you're in the Bitcoin space like you and I are, there's extra complications around how wallets and how money and crypto flows between accounts. So the auditors have to get comfortable with that before they can even start the audit process. So that's sort of parts of the steps required to get to a régimen simplificado, which is the first instrument you can release. There's another type of instrument you can release in Mexico that is also pre-IPO, and it's called a certificado bursátil. And it's like the régimen simplificado, but it has less restrictions, but more bureaucracy. So the régimen simplificado doesn't have to be formally approved by the government agency. It has to be endorsed by an investment bank that takes on more responsibility to ensure you're not being fraudulent, etc. The régimen simplificado has other limitations. For example, it's not available to retail investors. Only accredited investors, institutions can invest in a régimen simplificado. The certificado versátil, yes. Normal retail can also invest in that. So we're on the journey to do the first thing, which is the régimen simplificado. Once you've done that, it's easier to do a certificado versátil. And then you can do all this as you prep to do an IPO if you decide to go public yourself instead of acquiring a shell company or something else. So that's basically the journey that we're on. And we're still fairly early in the journey, but we've made progress.
Great to hear. I'm curious more specifically about the Bitcoin part of this whole audit. As you said, like these big institutions are really far away of understanding like all the implications of, for example, holding Bitcoin in a balance sheet, right? So when you rebranded for Arcadia, you also announced like official Bitcoin Treasury that is held by the company itself. I don't remember. I think it was 21 Bitcoins, right? Or am I wrong?
We started with 11 and then we added 5 more. So as of now, we're at
Okay, really close to 21.
yeah.
That's
Once you
gonna
guys
be
have
the next one, I guess.
exactly.
So I'm curious, like how, for example, this treasury of Bitcoin can be recognized by an auditor or like an investor that will take it seriously. Is there any custody structure that you have to have? Like, do you need to custody it with somebody else, or you can have a custody solution in house? How did that work so far? Did you have any conversation about that?
Yeah, of course, it's a good question. I mean, countries around the world, from an accounting perspective, treat things like digital assets differently in terms of how you're supposed to account for them on your balance sheet and what price are they accounted for. Are they accounted for at the price you bought it, the most recent price, or some other price. US only recently improved their laws around this, and they allow companies who have Bitcoin on their balance sheet to recognize the Bitcoin appreciation in price as an earning, like official earnings, but they're non-taxable while you don't sell them. So that's sort of the ideal outcome. Mexico's still kind of gray around how they treat that in terms of, as of now, Mexico does not tax you on unrealized earnings. So you don't have to pay tax on the increase in the value, but it's a little bit gray how you're supposed to account for the value of Bitcoin on your in your balance sheet, whether you should use the original price, the most recent price, or the price on some specified date before you report. So that part's still a little gray, but the law does allow us to account for it as an asset on our balance sheet. And we are, of course, doing that. I think going forward, like we assume the Mexico, because Mexico historically follows the US. If you look at it, I'm curious if you have a similar take that I do, but I kind of feel right now Mexico's around 5 years behind the US when it comes to all this stuff. And if you think about it, this is way too favorable to say about Arcadia B, but like, Strategy started buying Bitcoin in 2020, like August 2020. So that was just over 5 years ago. So maybe we're the strategy for Mexico. So we're starting about 5 years after they did. So it's kind of keeping on that trend of Mexico being 5 years behind we don't have an ETF yet. I don't know if there's going to be one anytime soon. So basically, it's a gray area for a while, but at least it's not illegal what we're doing. And I think there's going to be growing adoption and growing awareness and growing interest from public actors, we certainly, I'm sure you guys are experiencing Aureo as well. We're certainly experiencing a lot more interest in Bitcoin as a debasement hedge and, from family offices, from high net worth people. I don't know if it's Ricardo Salinas is helping get the word out or if people are just getting smarter and being more aware of what's happening in Mexico and globally around the currency, but we certainly are sensing an uptick in the interest in exposure to Bitcoin in different ways. With respect to you asked another question I didn't answer yet, which is around custody. So there are no current requirements around how you custody your Bitcoin. I think that's like a big gray area. They're not even looking at that yet. The only thing we know right now is like financial institutions like banks are not legally allowed to custody Bitcoin or recognize Bitcoin as collateral in loans, etc., whereas we can. So, like you guys, we have a custody service and we're custodying our own Bitcoin. And we are one of the only treasury companies in the world that has built their own custody solution and can build their and can custody their own Bitcoin. Well, that is true because we are a Bitcoin company just like you. Whereas almost all the other treasury companies are not Bitcoin. They did not start as a Bitcoin company. They started as something else. Or they started just to be a treasury, but not building any of the underlying Bitcoin technology behind.
Yeah, that's one point. Like, I'm actually curious if like the fact that you build your own custody solution might raise, for example, red flags from investors or even security risk for yourself or the founders. How much can you share about your custody solution so people can trust it versus exposing it to potential threats? How do you balance like this complicated question?
That's an insightful question. It almost feels like you've been in some of our meetings because some of our meetings with investors have been like, wait, you custody your own Bitcoin? Why don't you use Coinbase? Why don't you use. And of course, our company was founded with a bit of a cypherpunk ethos, and I think yours has been too, right? And not your keys, not your coins. If that applies to retail investors, to high net worth, if we're recommending to our customers that they do not custody Bitcoin on a major centralized exchange because of censorship resistance, because of risk of seizure, because they could be hacked, whatever. If we highly encourage our customers to never custody their Bitcoin in that way, why would we? We custody ourselves, and you are right that there are investors who are very gun shy about that. So we see it as a differentiator for us in a positive way, but not all investors do. But we're okay. If they don't understand why we're doing it this way and they don't want to invest because we're doing it this way, then that's fine. They shouldn't invest in us. That's fine. Um, the other point I was going to say, so you asked about, yeah, just like the risk to us. So one thing is like, do investors have a, concern about it? Some do. Some actually think it's awesome that we're that like cypherpunk that we're able to build our own custody technology and they endorse it, especially those who are also believers in self-custody. Regarding the safety, yeah, you're right that I have to be a little more cautious about what I say regarding exactly how we execute on this. But basically, we have at any given time keys in at least three different countries held by different people, and not everyone even knows who holds the keys, even inside the company or on the board. And we have a way to rotate key holdings without people knowing who's holding the keys at that time. So it's pretty safe because multi-sig model that's pretty robust, and no one or even two people could actually execute a transfer of any kind on their own, and they're not in the same country anyway. So um, it's pretty safe. I mean, there is maybe arguably no 100% safe solution. There's always some kind of risk in custody, but we prefer the risk the way we're managing it than like having it in a centralized custodian scenario.
Yeah, so great answer. I think I don't want to turn this into a debate because the goal is to interview your business model, like Arcadia and everything. I think there's some middle ground, with holding everything in one custodian versus a multi-institution custody. As you may know, early riders, a VC Bitcoin fund invested in Audio, and they also have the on-ramp company that have a multi-institution custody model, which kind of distribute the risk of having everything with one custodian. But again, you remove some part of the censorship resistant property of Bitcoin, but then you remove kind of the risk, the security risk. I don't know, what have you considered that maybe for your holdings, or what's your opinion about that model?
I support MIC. We do, as like I think it's still within the cypherpunk values and the censorship resistant. Like you said, everything has trade-offs. I think it's a good option. I'm familiar with on-ramp solution. I think it's a good option as well. I think, in fact, So we are now implementing a multi-option custody solution for our own customers. One is that we hold all the keys in our own multi-sig solution for our customers in the custody model. Another one is that we can hold one of the keys and they decide who holds the other keys. And another option is MIC, multi-institution custody, where we are one institution that holds one of the keys and they or us help figure out who are the other institutions, in what jurisdictions do they want the other keys held in. So that I think indicates our belief in MIC, multi-institution custody, as a viable option for customers that still avoids most of the censorship resistance and seizing risk of centralized exchanges. So yeah, I think it's a good option as well. As far as our core treasury, we're pretty committed to using our own multi-sig design for that. And that's what we are doing right now, but the future could change. I should mention, and I'm sure you're aware, but probably a lot of your listeners are not, there are pathways for certifying your self custody solution to become a qualified custodian, getting what's called SOC 2 compliant and some other things that basically do testing on the security of your multi-sig setup. And we are in the process of doing that. Well, that will also help investors feel a little more confident because we will have the certification.
And then once you get your certification, then you can probably insure the funds, right? So it makes it even more safe for investors, as
That
I imagine.
100%. And not only that, it actually makes it even more viable for us to do a MIC. Maybe even an on-ramp could be one of the institutions in that future, because on-ramp is a very credible, serious custody provider in the MIC world. And they're pretty rigorous about who can be another institution in their MIC. And it would have to be somebody who's also a qualified custodian. So in the stage we're at now, those companies wouldn't be inclined to want to do an MIC setup with us, but once we're qualified, that improves that as well. So, as you say, it will improve the credibility and the confidence that investors have, as well as other partners in the ecosystem.
I'm curious, how do you balance like the speech about, Bitcoin being the best money? It's a scarce asset. It's impossible to do censorship on it. So you approach investors in Mexico and you basically tell them, we can either sell you the Bitcoin directly and help you custody it, but you can also acquire this financial instrument that we will emit in the future. That makes the process way simpler, but obviously adds a third party, like a extra structure between the Bitcoin holdings and the investor. So how do you kind of do the sales pitch of like this whole package of services you do?
No, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think it's not necessarily underlying your question, because I didn't get the sense you're skeptical of this, but a lot of people in the cypherpunk world in Mexico are like, they have a lot of respect for our underlying business. And, it's been around for 8 years, 9 years almost. And, it's Jose Carlos and our other co-founder CTO are very cypherpunk. And so we have cred with that community. And the minute they found out we were going to do a treasury company, they're like, you guys are sellouts. You guys are people are Bitcoiners now, all that kind of stuff. So that's part of the issue with like diehard Bitcoiners, is them seeing it that way. And we have to address that FUD, that the fear, uncertainty, doubt that gets thrown around treasury stuff. So that's one thing. But with respect to like the dialogue with customers, so I was just sort of explaining the dialogue with diehard Bitcoiners, but the dialogue with customers, it's a very early we're very early in talking about the treasury strategy and the instruments with customers, because they're not available yet. We're in the early days of the process to get the first instrument issued, the régimen simplificado, and we're still several months away. It better happen in 2026. I'm counting on that, but we can't say for certainty what month it'll happen in. So we are starting those conversations, and the conversations are really interesting. What I would say is, so like what we like to say is, we're one of the only companies, not just in Mexico, in the world, that could say, however you want exposure to Bitcoin, we can offer almost all of it. Like, you want to buy Bitcoin and hold it in self custody. That's what we think is the best way to have exposure to Bitcoin. It's what we do individually. Well, we offer you that. We offer you the Bitcoin, but then we advise you on how to do your own self custody solution. You're not comfortable doing your own self custody, we have a custody solution for you. So then that's like moving up the chain. Well, you already have Bitcoin, but you want to use it for something, you want to leverage it. Well, we have a Bitcoin backed lending program. Okay, you have those things or you don't, but you want exposure without so much volatility. Well, we have instruments for that that are more like the preferreds, like the Sailor Stretch or, Strive's new instrument, SATA, that offer more of like a fixed yield, but cap your upside on Bitcoin volatility. And what we're finding is, I didn't actually expect this, but what we're finding is that there are a lot of these like family offices who have a diversified portfolio strategy and they deploy money in equities. They deploy money in bonds or bond like instruments. And they deploy money in commodities and real estate, for example. Well, what we're finding that I hadn't fully thought through until some of these meetings, but like some of them are interested in all of the above. Okay, we want to have some direct exposure to Bitcoin. We want some Bitcoin on our balance sheet for sure. Okay. Then it's a discussion around how to custody it. We can work on that. Some say we want that, but we also have this bucket for yield, like fixed income, but Arcadia B can offer way better yield than the normal like public bonds in Mexico. So that's interesting to us too, because that's a different bucket of money that we can deploy for that. We even have some that say, well, can we also consider doing an equity investment in the company itself before we're public? 'Cause, like once we're public, that would happen via an IPO and you buy shares in the public market. But while we're private, that would have to be a private equity deal, right? So this goes back to my point about whether it's Ricardo Salinas or like growing understanding of what's happening around debasement, but the appetite for getting like exposure to Bitcoin and maybe in more than one way is growing a lot in Mexico. And I asked Carlos about it. Jose Carlos recently, like, how does this compare these meetings to how he would his meetings he had years ago in Mexico? He says night and day. Like sometimes he would bring up Bitcoin in a meeting like that and they'd like kick him out of the room practically. And now it's like, no, no, come in, share more, explain it to us. We had a meeting a couple weeks ago, maybe it was a month ago, in Mexico City with a big family office. Very interesting conversation. The son is orange pill. Son is a executive in the company. Family business, very successful, big family business. He's already orange pill, but his dad is not. His dad is, closer to retirement, etc. His dad comes to the meeting. Says, I'm going to start the meeting by letting you know I'm very skeptical of Bitcoin. My son doesn't stop talking about it, but I don't fully buy it yet. We had an hour and a half conversation with him, and afterwards he wanted to buy single digit millions of dollars worth of Bitcoin. So we did a pretty good job orange pilling him, but my guess is his son has been in his ear long enough that it was like, even though he was skeptical, he was receptive at least. He wasn't slamming the door on us. So the long story short is I think there's a lot more interest in Mexico happening now than ever before, from high net worth, from family offices, from institutions, hopefully in the future from pension funds, the Afores. And increasingly there's receptivity to a range of ways to get exposure to Bitcoin. And that's one of our unique selling properties that we have, is that we can offer them that whole range.
Yeah, I apologize if my question was a little bit biased. I think you guessed I'm not necessarily a fan of like treasury companies, but as you said, I think in the end, like high net worth individuals, family offices, or corporations, or even an institution will choose to kind of distribute how they own Bitcoin. And that's what happens with our clients and the conversation we've had so far about MIC as well. Because in the end, it's always the saying, right? Don't put all your eggs in the same basket. Sorry, I apologize if I didn't want to put you in a corner or
You do
interrupt
it.
you, but
It's all good. It's all good.
I think we should mention, well, as you said, you mentioned Ricardo Salinas as maybe being the person that kind of made this conversation about Bitcoin more easy. But at the same time, he's a really controversial figure. He has some problems with the government. So in the end, do you think it's a positive like thing happening for Bitcoin here in Mexico? Or is it a bad thing because some people really don't like him? So if you tell them about Bitcoin, they're gonna associate it with Ricardo Salinas or Tio Ricci, as they said, and they just don't want to hear about it. What's your take on that?
Definitely a controversial public figure in Mexico. From my experience over the last few months, most of our clients at Arcadia B are high net worth or businesses. And most high net worth individuals and business owners, at least the ones I know have met, are actually pretty supportive of Ricardo Salinas, side with him in his fight against the government anyway. And those that are not as favorable about him as a person or his business practices, they have mad respect for the success he's had in his career. So they're business people or they're wealthy people, and they, like they say, it's like game respects game. It's like an English expression. Like if you're a successful business owner, you respect other successful business owners. Ricardo Salinas is one of the most successful business owners in all of Mexico. You might not love everything about him, so some people might have negative views about him personally, but they're like, okay, the kind of money this guy has generated in his life and the fact he's decided to allocate so much of his portfolio, about 80%, to Bitcoin is pretty compelling validation that maybe I, as a business owner who haven't made as much money as him or as successful as him, need to take Bitcoin a little more seriously. Maybe all the thought I've heard about it's being bad for the environment or, it's for drug dealers. Maybe I need to get past these, misconceptions about Bitcoin and learn a little bit more. So, from my perspective, in the private sector, Ricardo Salinas' very public Bitcoin promotion is beneficial to our businesses, yours and ours. I think where it could be negative for us is like in our case, we need to get regulatory approval for our instruments, for everything we're doing. And in that scenario, it's not ideal if we are directly associated with him because, the government has a public dispute with him. So maybe they want to, it's kind of like how people in the US right now, there's like half the population hates Trump and half of them love him or whatever the percentage is right now. I saw data today, it's more like 39% still love him and the rest don't. So it's like, well, he's also known for being pro Bitcoin. So there are a lot of people who don't understand Bitcoin yet, and they're like, oh, well, Trump is pro Bitcoin, so I hate Bitcoin. So we know that there are going to be people like that in Mexico that have that mindset, and within the government, there's gonna be some negative perception of Bitcoin because Ricardo Salinas is like wearing the bandera, the flag of Bitcoin very proudly and publicly. There are probably some people in government say, oh, well, if Salinas is all pro Bitcoin, then we should be against it. So I think there might be a risk around that. I hope not. So far, the people we've interacted with, even in the more government space, they haven't brought that up and it hasn't felt like that's going to be a conflict, but it could happen.
Yeah, everybody at some point will understand that Bitcoin is not only for friends but for enemies as well. So this is just the neutrality of Bitcoin will prevail, I believe.
100%.
You have started as KapitalX, and you had some line of products that you were offering for your clients, but now you're doing a whole revamp. I had the chance to see some mock-ups of the app during the conference in Merida, so just wanted to give you a chance to talk about it. Are there any innovations that you brought up with this new revamp? And yeah, just show your services.
Thanks for asking. Yeah, so our app was really bad, being honest. The the app that's still in the App Store is under the KapitalX brand, the original brand, and it's not good. The UX and UI is not good. And so it's a barrier. It creates friction for new users to like download and use it. And so you get a lot of people that start the KYC, they know your customer process, and then they stop, or they get the whole app downloaded and they've done KYC, but they can't figure out how to transfer their Mexican pesos into the app and they just stop using it. And so, it hasn't been a very good experience for people, even my wife. It was kind of funny. She'd be mad if I said this, but like my wife used to work in product innovation and oversaw app development before. She downloaded our app and was like, "I'm sorry, Boyd. I love you and I love what you're trying to do, but I'm not going to use that." She's like, "When you have your new app ready, let me know. I'll become a customer when your new app is ready." So, it's been a 6-month process to revamp our app, and it's coming out within. We're going to have the final app deployed for internal testing within about 10 days, which is very exciting after a 6-month journey, but then we have to do some testing before it's released. So sometime in February it'll be out. But the story of what we offer is on and off ramp for Bitcoin and stable coins. I think that's similar to Aureo. I think after that, there's probably a lot of differences between our products and services, which is a good thing. We're growing the market together along with other companies in Mexico, but we each have our own strategies and our own products. We have an active and growing lending business. In fact, that's the fastest growing part of our business. And that, like, even in the current app, but the new app makes it way easier. You can just deposit Bitcoin however much you want. It's a 2-for-1 lending product. So you deposit 1 Bitcoin, you get zero point 0.5 Bitcoin equivalent in fiat. And that's the current lending product, which has grown. And we're about to launch a brand new version of the lending product, which is tied to real estate. So this, I don't even think this has ever been mentioned publicly yet. So this is the first time we're doing like a soft product launch on your pod, I guess. The first thing, and this is all like based on customer demand. So we have a lot of our existing customers and some new ones who've said, "Can I leverage the equity I have in my real estate to get more Bitcoin?" And so we're building a lending product for that. And we're gonna start deploying. We're now offering. So up until now, we've only offered Mexican peso denominated loans, but we're now just about to offer USD because we can offer way better rates that our customers want for this product. So you basically get USD loan, but we put your title to your property and the Bitcoin we buy with your loan. We put it in We have a brand new. It's called an asofom. I know Gustavo knows about it because I heard him talk about it on his pod. But an isofoma is like, for your listeners, it allows you to have a fiduciary trust, and you can do a lot more things on behalf of your customers, including like custody their real estate assets or their Bitcoin in a more legally compliant way. So we're offering that service now, and we have our first 3 or 4 loans pre-approved for that. So we have the trading, Bitcoin and stablecoin. We have lending, which now involves real estate as well as an option. We have a credit card, which is very soon going to have, like, very soon. When I say very soon, like in the next couple of days, customers will start to earn Bitcoin cashback on their transactions. We have a DCA program we just launched, dollar cost averaging, where a customer basically puts their credit card of choice on file. Doesn't have to be ours, can be anyone, and they tell us how frequently they want to be charged for, and it's like a way to like automate their savings plan. So those are the main services we have. Some of them are brand new, being launched with the new app. We also are just now launching our referral program because when our app wasn't any good, it was too hard for customers to refer their friends and family to use the app because no one could figure out how to use it very easily. So we're launching that too. So yeah, a lot of exciting stuff this year.
Great. I'm glad you chose the podcast to soft launch a new product. I still don't have thousands of followers, right? It's just starting, but thank you for that. And yeah, I'm aware of like the soft structure for the loans on top of real estate. But so far, what I've understood with that structure is that even if you have some kind of trust that holds the real estate, the LTV ratio is pretty low in Mexico, despite having the structure. I guess the market is not liquid enough, or there isn't enough trust in Mexico to have like a good LTV. Can you share a bit more? How did you resolve that, or is it public yet?
I mean, it's not
Just curious.
public, but it's not a secret really. So like if our current lending product is 2-for-1. So you put in 1 Bitcoin, you get half a Bitcoin in fiat. Okay. We're keeping the 2-for-1 model, but instead of it being 2-for-1 with Bitcoin, one entire amount is the Bitcoin and the other entire amount is the value of the real estate. So we have an appraiser go and evaluate the value of the land. This is probably worth mentioning here. There are some products like this we've seen in the US, but like in the US, for example, there's a company called Horizon, and they do this with your primary residence. We don't want to touch primary residence. It's not our interest. Our customer base doesn't seem to want to do it either, but we don't want to because we don't want to be in a position of having to try to foreclose or sell somebody's primary residence. That's just not fun. So we're only doing it with people who have like secondary property, commercial property. If they rent out homes to other people, they can put those in. We don't evaluate the revenue, the cash flow of their property. It's not relevant to our lending product. We just need the value of the land. So the value of the land plus the value of the Bitcoin that we buy on their behalf with the loan that they take from us is basically retaining our 2-for-1 lending strategy. So we have double the asset value of the loan amount. And really, the risk of margin call is virtually zero because Bitcoin would have to crash to almost zero for us to have to look at their real estate. And our ambition in the way we've designed the product is that we never do ever have to liquidate someone's real estate. And there's like all Bitcoin lending products, there are ways that people can top up their loan. We can notify them, hey, you're in a risky situation now. You need to add more Bitcoin to your collateral. And then that keeps your real estate safe and everything else. So that's kind of how that model is working right now. So it still retains the 2-for-1, which is a fairly traditional model in Bitcoin lending.
Yeah, I like the fact that you don't want to seize the homes of the families, right? That doesn't make sense. Yeah, I also really personally believe, well, at Aureo as well, there's a big bridge to be built between real estate and Bitcoin in Mexico because traditionally people kind of trust that more. They don't hold that. I mean, I'm talking about the middle class, right? Like the first thing that you need to do as an individual is get a home first before you invest in stocks or this kind of stuff. So I'm curious to see how well it would work out for you. Yeah, we're approaching 1 hour. I know that you had only 1 hour fixed. I guess I can finish I will put like all your books and a website, under the description so people can also go read on the Bitcoin singularity. But just to finish off like the episode, you said there is Arcadia now, there's Aureo, there's other Bitcoin companies such as Bitcoin, Yopaki entering the scene, and there's obviously the big players, the real competition, as I would say, Binance, Bitso, BitGet, then they invest massively in Mexico right now. And also you said that there's like kind of a explosion of Bitcoin interest in Mexico. There's La Casa de Satoshi that was founded last year. There's Bitcoin Monterrey network that you're part of, that you created with Adrian. So we have this growth, this path going up, but what else do you think is missing in the space to accelerate that, and how can we make this happen sooner? The whole Bitcoin adoption.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with your assessment. I think the strength of Mexico and Bitcoin adoption, in my opinion, is primarily grassroots, as you started talking about. I think there's about 9 communities across Mexico: Veracruz, Monterrey, Mexico City, Guadalajara. There's a handful more that are Mayan Bitcoin, of course, that are gaining traction with like cypherpunks, with retail investors, with some small, medium-sized businesses that are embracing Bitcoin. And as we talked about throughout this pod, we're also starting to see growing interest, awareness, and adoption from high net worth people and some larger business owners, etc. What is totally absent in the market right now, which maybe isn't that bad, I don't know, it depends on how you look at it. Like, banks don't get it. They're not interested. They see it as risky. The central bank doesn't get it. They recently published something talking about how it's too volatile and too risky, etc. The government is really not paying attention to Bitcoin right now. They have other things they're worried about. I think in general, there's lack of understanding between crypto and Bitcoin. What's the difference and all the rest of that. And that goes back to your point you made in your question around like the Bitsos and the Binances and Coinbases. We internally at Arcadia B don't even think of them as competition. because they're serving a different market. They're casinos, and they're serving people who want to take bets on gambles on crypto and maybe buy Bitcoin. They're not services buying for Bitcoiners like Oreo and Arcadia B are, right? Like we only think about what Bitcoiners want because that's all we care about. Whether you're an existing Bitcoiner or a new one. And I know you guys are exactly the same way. You have the same values we have and, very committed to servicing the Bitcoin community. And so as a result, we think of things the Bitsos and the Coinbases and the Binances don't even think about because they're not thinking about our customer base, which are people like us who understand debasement, understand absolute scarcity of Bitcoin, who recognize that Bitcoin is something totally different from crypto, don't want to touch crypto. And we gradually, as we accumulate more and people around us accumulate more, we gradually want to do more with our Bitcoin, as you said, whether that's real estate or lending or do other things. So I think the big players don't even make us nervous at all. I love all of us who are trying to build and make things happen in Mexico. I think we need more of us, obviously. Again, where I think there's a gap in the market is the major institutions, public and private, national government, central banks, private banks, they don't get it. But again, you could argue, I mean, government's different, especially like in our case, because we need more, regulatory approval for everything you want to do. But like the fact that banks are staying on the sideline is maybe just a huge opening for us. It's hard to know because, like, there's this debate about like, do ETFs and banks adopting Bitcoin actually grow the entire market for Bitcoin and start to open up more opportunities for us? Because some people who start with banks will eventually realize, no, I don't want to custody in the bank and I want to have more things that these other companies do, but they're leaving this whole market for us right now, basically. And so let's take advantage of it together and grow adoption, grow awareness. And that's what I think we're trying to do together with your pod, with La Casa de Satoshi, with our conference in Merida. We're all trying to sort of build that awareness and the grassroots adoption. And eventually the governments and the banks will figure it out. But in the meantime, we'll do our job as entrepreneurs and build the market.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I'm not sure the other shitcoin casino, as you said, are not competition, but I guess that's a subject for another time. They still sell a lot of Bitcoin, right? So that's what companies like ours want to do. I forgot one last question that was really important for me personally. I'm sorry if I'm extending this. We're obviously foreigners, as you said, gringos. For those who don't know, gringo can be kind of a pejorative term that people use to describe mostly Americans, but foreigners in general that are in Mexico. Just curious, do you have any advice? What's your experience doing business as a foreigner in Mexico? How are people perceiving this? I'm just curious about your personal kind of experience.
So this is my third or fourth time living in a Latin American country, and my experience has always been, well, I'll say outside of Chile, has always been very positive in terms of like the private sector, universities, government sort of embracing me as like a thought leader from outside their region who can bring in new ideas and is trying to innovate and build things. And I've always found a lot of receptivity. I say except for Chile because this is going to offend somebody, including my friends in Chile, but like Chileans, from my experience, were more closed minded to foreigners and a little bit more discriminatory against foreigners no matter where you're from. I find in Mexico, the receptivity is very high. Like, I don't forget the business world, just like on the street. And I think you do your best to try to speak Spanish as well. My wife is Venezuelan. I know you had a guest the other day from Venezuela, and that's a whole nother country to talk about regarding hyperinflation and all that crap. But we have felt very well received here. I speak fluent Spanish because I've been speaking Spanish at home, but in the professional world of Bitcoin and in the private world of engaging with people, building friendships, I have found zero barriers to building a business here, to gaining traction, to getting interest in my ideas. So Yeah, I think this is a great country for foreigners in the sense of they're hungry for new ideas, they're hungry for innovation, they're not discriminatory. I mean, I'm from the States and, I live a couple hours from the States. And so the US has had a big influence on the northern part of Mexico. I'm in Monterrey, and Nuevo León is very Americanized in a lot of ways, for better or worse. It's like a fusion between the US and Mexico, and probably even that helps my adjustment here. But yeah, I mean, I think you're adapting just well. And you and I are both, executives in Bitcoin companies here as foreigners. I know in your case, Gustavo is also not Mexican, although he's Latino by birth. So that's a little different. Partner is Mexican, so that kind of helps. Having someone on your team who has the understanding of like the nuances of how things work here, and even like you can imagine all the kind of stuff we're having to deal with around taxation and legal stuff for trying to go public. And Jose Carlos has way better understanding of that than I do. So certainly tapping into those networks on your team and outside of it are important. But yeah, I don't know what your take is, but my feeling has been very positive regarding the receptivity to being a foreigner building something like this here. Well, what's your response to that?
Yeah, really similar actually, because on X you see some hate about digital nomads not paying taxes, and some protests in like Condesa La Roma, which are like the gentrified neighborhood in Mexico City. So obviously you see that online, but in real life, I never felt nothing like that. I guess it also comes because, if somebody sees that you're integrated, that you're following the laws, you're not staying here as an illegal immigrant, and you're learning Spanish and you speak good Spanish, they're actually proud, kind of. I feel that you want to live in their country, make it better. So yeah, really similar to your experience. And you're totally right in regards of hiring. As you said, the whole executive team is completely, well, from Canada, even if Gustavo was born in Peru, but we already started hiring locally. I mean, we don't have any intention of hiring somebody from the US. That just doesn't make any sense to progress as a company here. So yeah, really similar kind of take as yours.
Nice.
Yeah. So if anybody's listening and maybe thinking of coming to Mexico, work in the Bitcoin space, kind of on the new frontier of Bitcoin adoption, you can follow our advice and come here. Any closing words, Boyd? Thank you so much about the podcast, but any closing words?
First of all, thanks for reaching out, because in some countries that wouldn't happen because some people would say we compete in some areas, and yet you're giving me a voice to talk about what we do. So, a lot of respect for that. We obviously invited you guys to join us at our conference that we were sort of co-sponsoring in Merida. And I think that's how we have to build the ecosystem, by competing and collaborating and growing the space together. I think I'll leave you with one thought that I have shared with other Bitcoin maxis who have skepticism about treasury companies. Do you know how many people live in Mexico? Roughly, do you know the population?
130 million,
Exactly.
more or less.
130 million. How many of them have an Afore pension account? I don't expect you to know that answer, but
I actually know, because we just published our first report analyzing the flaws of the pension public system in Mexico.
thank you.
You should read it and then give your feedback, because it's not perfect. I think it has a lot of great information, but one of our mission is to kind of delve into this kind of subject, and to have like, you know, so I think it's around 40%, if I'm not wrong.
So the data I have is 69 to 70 million. So we're somewhere, yeah, your data might say 60 million, mine says 70, but so we're in that range, 60 to 70 million.
So that's around 40%, right? Yeah.
Yeah. My point is the following, and I knew you did that study. I haven't looked at it yet, but I saw it because I saw you mentioned in Twitter today, and I actually like forwarded it because I want to look at it later. The reason I'm so passionate about treasury companies is that, and in Mexico, is because individuals in Mexico cannot direct their allocation of their pension fund to anything. whatever the pension fund chooses to invest in, that's out of their hands. So some of your listeners, like in the US, won't know that it works that way here because in some markets like the US, the individual can still say, oh, I want within my pension fund, I want to allocate some money to this and that. Doesn't work here that way. If you have an Afore account, you're about half of the population of the country. You have your pension is tied up in something that is generally returning less per year than the amount of M2 money growth supply. So, imagine if Aureo and Arcadia B and maybe some other companies could scale. How long would it take us to reach 70 million people with some kind of exposure to Bitcoin in Mexico? Like, they're not orange pilled yet. Like, forget it, right? So, if we can use the Treasury strategy to get higher yields by tapping into that upside volatility in Bitcoin with yield generating instruments that the Afore pension funds can buy, we can improve the returns for about half of Mexico's population when it comes to their retirement. And we believe we can gradually orange pill all those people because as they start to see that the pension funds that first adopt this Bitcoin exposure have better returns, they're going to move their money to a different pension fund because that pension fund has understood they need Bitcoin exposure. And then gradually, we can get some of those people to move not just from having it in their pension, but to actually wanting to have it in self custody. And that is really our ambition. Like Arcadia B was born with this idea, KapitalX really, of like accelerating mass adoption of Bitcoin in Mexico. There is no other faster way to accelerate mass adoption of Bitcoin in Mexico than get Bitcoin exposure inserted into Afores. And the only way to do that is through a treasury strategy. So that's why we're doing it. And hopefully, given that you've done a deep dive into 4 days as well, you can appreciate that. And maybe I'm orange pilling you on treasuries just a little bit more.
It was a good closing thought because it wants me to start the debate again. But this solution, actually, as you said, like treasury companies inside the public pension system, we haven't mentioned it as a solution inside the report. It's a little bit biased towards what we're offering. So, for example, we mentioned the Cartwright's pension fund in the UK that directly allocates, makes a Bitcoin allocation with the MIC solution of on-ramp. But I think to make the report really transparent, we can probably add this also the mention of treasury companies that will make it more complete and more transparent in the regards of what can be offered for the general population in terms of Bitcoin exposure. But yeah, that's a great. I think you'll have a lot of feedback on the report, so that's a great. Maybe we can do another
Maybe next year we do it
episode.
together.
Yes. Ah, yeah, that would be cool. Definitely.
All right.
All right. We could talk even more, but thank you, Boyd, again. Have a so good luck with the launch of your product in the upcoming weeks.
Thank you, Maciej. Nice to chat with you again and good luck with Aureo as well.
Thank you.
Cheers.